All right, so today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to jump into the near future and break down a really fascinating and detailed scenario of what the United States could look like in February 2026. And, spoiler alert, it's a nation facing some huge changes both at home and on the world stage.
So get this. In this 2026 scenario, this is the official slogan you'd see on the White House website. Welcome to the Golden Age. But if you peel back that optimistic layer, the reality on the ground seems to be something else entirely. A story of growing global isolation and some pretty serious economic weakness.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at how the rest of the world is changing. Then, we'll see how that hits the economy back home. After that, we'll look at the cracks that start to show up in society. And finally, we'll get into a political backlash that's starting to brew. So first up, let's look at the world stage. Because in this scenario, it seems like the world is kind of reorganizing itself, forming new partnerships that, well, seem to be leaving the United States on the sidelines.
And it looks like a major turning point was this Munich Security Conference, where a really strong ideological speech from the U.S. Secretary of State apparently pushed these traditional European allies to start looking elsewhere for partners.
And wow, this slide really shows you just how fast things are changing. I mean, you've got Canada leading a huge new economic alliance and even renewing ties with China. France and India are deepening their own defense partnership. And Germany? They're turning to Ukrainian veterans, not the U.S., for modern warfare training. It really seems like the world is moving on.
So you might be asking, how does all this global stuff connect back home? Well, this new reality isn't just about foreign policy. It starts to hit home with some really direct and pretty painful consequences for the U.S. economy.
Okay, so you've got the administration talking up a rising stock market, right? But if you dig into the data, a much more complicated story emerges. When you compare it to a global index, U.S. markets are actually underperforming, badly. In fact, it's their worst showing against the rest of the world in over 30 years.
And then you look at job growth, and it's basically slowed to a crawl. You go from adding almost 1.5 million jobs in 2024 to just 181,000 in all of 2025. I mean, if you don't count the pandemic, that's the absolute worst year for hiring since 2003.
And it's not just about hiring either. The manufacturing sector is actually losing jobs, and you're seeing these huge red flags popping up in commercial real estate. Delinquency rates are hitting levels we haven't seen since the financial crisis, with a staggering $100 billion in loans projected to go into default.
And what about the government's own books? Well, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office is projecting a federal deficit of nearly $2 trillion. To put that into perspective, for every single dollar the government is expected to collect, it's set to spend $1.33.
Right? So this economic pressure, it's not just numbers on a page, It's creating some major impacts on the ground. Everything from labor shortages to real dissent bubbling up inside the government itself. So for example, let's look at what's being called the Florida effect. A state law passed back in 2023 targeting undocumented labor ended up causing a mass exodus of foreign workers. The result? Now key industries like farming and construction are facing these severe labor shortages. And this quote from a Wall Street Journal editorial really hits the nail on the head. The issue isn't just about finding any workers. It's about finding Americans who are willing to do these specific, really demanding jobs in agriculture and construction, even when the pay is pretty good. So what's happening with all that government spending? Well, the promise was to cut waste. But in this scenario, any savings from cuts to social programs are just completely overshadowed by a huge surge in new spending on immigration enforcement and expanded military action overseas. And all these changes, they're causing some serious friction inside the government itself. Senior Coast Guard officials are apparently alienated by their new missions. The Homeland Security Secretary's own spokesperson has resigned. And in Minnesota, state investigators are claiming the FBI is straight up refusing to share information in a police shooting investigation.
So you've got all this pressure building up, global, economic, social, and it's no surprise that it starts to spark a new kind of political backlash, one that's finding its voice in some pretty unexpected places.
And right at the heart of this backlash is James Tallarico, who's a Texas Senate candidate and also a divinity student. His message is a direct challenge to the administration's ideology, basically calling it a worship of power that betrays the core teachings of Christianity. So Tallarico's message pretty much exploded onto the national stage, but not in the way you'd expect. Late-night host Stephen Colbert comes out and announces that his own network flat out refused to air an interview he'd already taped with him. Okay, so how does that even happen?
How does a network block its own show? Well, it all boils down to this small, pretty technical change in the FCC's equal time rule. See, for 20 years, talk show interviews were considered newsworthy and were exempt, but a new interpretation targeting shows with partisan purposes closed that loophole, which made it practically impossible for the network to air the interview without having to give equal time to every single other candidate.
So you've got these traditional media doors slamming shut. What happens then? Where does a movement like this go? What's next?
Well, this is what happened next. Instead of just letting it die, Colbert posts the entire 15-minute interview on YouTube. By that same night, it already had 3.8 million views. It became his most watched interview in months.
And that really brings everything full circle, doesn't it? This whole scenario for 2026 paints a picture of a country that's really at a crossroads. It's facing all these interconnected challenges: global isolation, a struggling economy, deep divisions at home, and a political countermovement that's now just bypassing traditional media entirely. And it all leaves you with this one final, really big question to think about. In our digital age, what really happens when someone tries to silence a message? Does it just fade away, or does the very act of trying to suppress it end up making it even louder?